One of the big benefits of combining sectors when you're trying to integrate wind and solar power is that you can get access to very cheap, large energy storage in heat and transport, which you can't access in the electricity sector. That's the real perk from a integrating renewables perspective of doing the smart energy system.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome everyone to Energy Unplugged. My name's Ben Collie, I'm a principal at Aurora, and my guest on the show today is David Connolly, who is CEO of the Irish Wind Energy Association, IWEA, which is Ireland's largest renewable energy association. Previously, David was an associate professor in energy planning at Aalborg University in Copenhagen, where his research focused on the design and assessment of 100% renewable energy systems for electricity, heat and transport. He's published 25 peer-reviewed journal articles, generating over 7,500 citations, and he's been involved in projects worth over 25 million euro in research funding to date. So it's a real privilege to have you on the program today. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much for having me, Ben. Delighted to be here.
Today, we're going to be talking about a few different topics, but one of the things I really wanted to start off with, David, was to do with that career path that we've heard a little bit about. Your career has taken you through academia and you've worked on some really groundbreaking topics. But I wanted to ask you about this idea of smart energy systems, which I understand has been a focus of a fair part of your research. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means and the areas that you've been working on applying it to?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Ben. It's been a kind of funny career path, all right. I very much started in the kind of core of academia for about 10 years and then moved into industry afterwards. So I've certainly had a very wide range and set of experiences even to date. And like, I suppose for me, there was a real kind of moment in the early stages of my career where I was at a power station in the west coast of Ireland. And we were doing a tour as part of an excursion from the university. And like every coal-fired power station, you know, on the tour, the guys told us about how over half of the energy of this power station is actually going into the river next door.
That's amazing. Just sort of lost as excess heat.
Yeah, just lost. So this part, like in Ireland, we don't really have any district heating. So it's the power stations just produce electricity. So all of the heat from, it was Ireland's largest power station, still is Ireland's largest power station. It doesn't operate nearly as much anymore, being a coal-fired power station. But like when I was on that tour and kind of coming towards the end of my mechanical engineering degree at the time, like it really hit me about, God, climate change is such a big challenge, and yet it feels like we're doing things in a very bad way, let's say. And that's, right, I suppose, what really triggered my interest in the whole energy system as a whole. And I think the reason I use that as an example is I think that really captures what the smart energy system is about. Because like when you look at that power station in Ireland, that exact same power station when I was living in Denmark would never have wasted that heat. It would have taken that heat and put it into a district heating system and use that to heat the homes of people living in urban areas. Okay. So, for example, like Copenhagen, where I used to live, was 99% district heating. So the exact same power station situated in Copenhagen was operating at an efficiency of probably 75, 80, 85%, whereas the power station in Ireland, because it was only producing electricity, was probably operating at 40%. And I suppose the smart energy system is about looking at those synergies that exist, not in individual parts of the energy system, be it electricity, heat and transport, but across the energy system. So yes, a power station was primarily used to produce electricity, but back in the 70s, a few very clever Danes realized, do you know what? This actually also produces quite a lot of heat. And even though it was probably designed originally to produce electricity, there's a real synergy here between the electricity and the heat sector. Why not let's utilize that to make the system more efficient? And I think it seems like such an obvious example, but like the crazy thing is the vast majority of our power stations do exactly the same thing that Irish power station did when I visited it 10, 15 years ago. So, I think there's an awful lot for us to do to become smarter. And that's only this like kind of one example. I think what we did in our research in Aalborg University was look at where are there lots of other synergies like that we can utilize, and not just from an efficiency perspective, but from a renewable energy perspective as well.
So you were thinking about getting the most out of the energy by integrating different parts of the system. And I know I mentioned that you've been looking at 100% renewable energy systems. What sort of characteristics does the system need to have in order to accommodate that amount of renewable energy?
Yeah, like I think the two core pillars, if I was to kind of really kind of pare it back, the two key pillars of the smart energy system is to make things more efficient and to make the system better at integrating variable renewables. I think that's the kind of two pillars. And I think the reason for the latter is because we're all going to have to rely for the vast majority of countries on variable renewables as the backbone of our decarbonized energy system. And I purposely say energy there and not electricity, because I think we've often thought of like the way that we always used to present the concept of the energy system to people was in the past we've had electricity, heat and transport probably as separate siloed places. Like even when you look at government departments, you'll often see the Department of Energy will have like an electricity utility and a gas utility looking at typically electricity and heat separately, and then you'll have a Department of Transport looking at transport. Whereas if we bring those three together and start looking at the synergies, I think there's a lot to be gained, as I said, on them two things: efficiency and helping us to integrate more variable renewable energy in a better way. And I think that's the core principles that the smart energy system is trying to solve. I think the efficiency I've probably given you, I think a kind of a good example, but I think just to kind of bring the other one along, the second pillar, like one of the big benefits of combining sectors when you're trying to integrate wind and solar power is that you can get access to very cheap, large energy storage in heat and transport, which you can't access in the electricity sector. So that's the real perk from a integrating renewables perspective of doing the smart energy system.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that explanation. It's certainly useful for me to understand more about how smart energy systems figured in your research. I think a lot of our listeners, especially those who are directly involved in the Irish energy system, will be keen to hear about how you've brought your thinking that you developed in Denmark across to Ireland, because I understand that you looked at what a net zero system might look like for Ireland, or what a smart energy system might look like for Ireland, in a study that you worked on called Green Plan Ireland on this topic.
I did, yeah, back in 2014, I suppose, as a kind of side project when I was living in Denmark at the time. I kind of felt just to be really interesting to see what would these numbers look like if I was to apply them to the homeland, you could say, in Ireland. So I wrote this paper, and it's published and free. It's open access, so anyone can download it. If you type in probably my name and Green Plan Ireland, I'm sure it'll come up. And that's where I took a lot of the research that we were working on at that time in the research group in Aalborg University, and applied it to the, let's say, energy system of Ireland, and looked at how it would come together. And so in Green Plan Ireland, it's kind of, I tried to divide it up into 7, let's say, steps. Well, it was 6 steps back then, but if I had to redo it today, I'd probably do 7 steps. So in the results in the paper, I kind of list what I think are the really big wins that you get when you do a smart energy system. And so those were the one I gave you the example about there. Instead of wasting the heat from our power stations, if we use them for heating, so putting district heating in the cities of Ireland. The second was if we used heat pumps to provide heating in rural areas. Effectively, then we can use our wind and solar power to get our clean electricity to provide heat to our homes in the countryside.
Okay.
The fourth was making our grids the third was making our grids much smarter. And I think EirGrid and ESB Networks in Ireland are doing great work in that space. Like we integrate very large amounts of wind power already in Ireland, but we still have a long way to go. So that just means we can, on a windy day, we can use more of it by having a smarter grid. The fifth was EVs, electric vehicles. So now starting to get into the transport, getting our wind into the wheels of our cars. And then the sixth, now this is, the fifth or the sixth. So the fifth is what I'd introduced now, which wasn't in the paper. If I was to redo it again, my step 5 would be electric roads, which is a bit of a wild concept, and I can maybe come back to it later if you want to talk about it. And then the last 2 steps were quite similar. It was for the hard to decarbonize sectors like heavy duty transport, ships, aviation. It was using effectively what's termed in different ways power to fuels, electrofuels, synthetic fuels, and effectively using renewable electricity to make clean fuels. And I think that's probably where the really, really big energy storage benefit comes that I just talked about with smart energy systems. Because once you start producing fuel from wind and solar power, you effectively connect wind and solar to really large amounts of cheap energy storage, which is really helpful.
Yeah. And I suppose that, I guess that links in with one of the topics we've been thinking about a lot at Aurora recently, which is hydrogen and green hydrogen production in particular. But I suppose it goes beyond that as well, right? If you want to use synthetic fuels in some applications, there are further steps beyond the production of hydrogen that are needed.
Yeah, that's as well. Like the way I'd often describe it to people is in the same way that grain is the base product for lots of food products, hydrogen is maybe the base product for lots of fuel products. So like, we can grow grain to then make bread or cakes or whatever we might like, but they often use the same base product to get started. And I think hydrogen is going to be like that in the future, where hydrogen is a really key base product, but what you then do with the hydrogen can be quite varied. Like you can do everything from, produce a synthetic methane, like a gas, if you combine hydrogen with carbon as CH4, or you can go down a liquid fuel route and take the hydrogen, combine it with carbon in a different way and make some kind of like synthetic methanol, which is like petrol, or synthetic DME, which is like diesel. Or else you can even take the hydrogen and potentially produce ammonia, as another fuel. So it's almost like the hydrogen is your base product. And I think that's why a lot of the time we have these different terms for what is it actually, when you look back at it, a very similar process. So whether it's, people call it, let's say, hydrogen production or green hydrogen from wind and solar, others call it electrofuels, some call it power to fuels, some call it synthetic fuels. And I think even though we've these different terms right now, I think underneath all of the terms, there's actually a really similar process going on there, which is taking renewable electricity, producing hydrogen, and then doing something with that hydrogen to really, I suppose, satisfy the needs of hard to decarbonize areas like trucks, ships, aviation, those type of sectors.
In the context of the Irish market, one of the things we've been thinking about at Aurora is what getting to a net zero system in 2050 might look like. And we've thought about systems with different amounts of battery storage, or with carbon capture, or with hydrogen production and synthetic fuels and so on. I'd be really interested in your views, David, on what it would take to get the right balance of measures to take Ireland towards net zero emissions, given the thinking that you've done.
Yeah, so like I think there's always a few fundamental principles that you can put in. Like in many ways, I often find when we did our research, it was easier to talk about 2050 than it often was to talk about 2030. And then the reason I used to say that, or kind of even when some of the teaching and research I did, was by 2050, there's some really strict principles you have to live by that rule out a lot of options and that leave you with probably a shorter list of options than you would have if you were only looking at what we might do to nudge the dial in the right direction over the next 10 years, if that makes sense. And I think one of the fundamentals that I find is really important to just do at the very outset is, one, look at what your demands are. So what do you need in terms of your electricity needs, your heat needs, and your transport needs by the year 2050? And what resources have you got to meet those needs? And like in my research, we used to do quite a different as analysis for different countries. And it was actually quite interesting how those questions, or the answers to those questions, could actually vary quite significantly depending on the country you were looking at. So like somewhere like Ireland has a lot of wind, for example. But I remember doing a study for the Czech Republic. They don't have a lot of wind, or at least certainly not at the same scale that we do in Ireland, and actually it was a very much more different problem to try and solve, where you were looking at, they'll likely depend on their neighboring countries to provide some of their resource, or take the likes of Germany as well. I think it was another interesting study where just the scale of their demands was enormous, compared to like the likes of Ireland, which has population of 4.5-5 million, versus Germany 60, 70, 80 million that they need to meet. So when you just looked at those two starting points, what resources have you got and what demands do you need to meet? Suddenly you start to realize actually, your options and what you can do start to become very clear. Let's put it that way. And I think the one that definitely then, the third question I would think that often jumps out as soon as you kind of compare those two with each other is, what level of bioenergy especially are you willing to use, or do you consider sustainable to use? Because bioenergy is almost like perfect as a replacement for fossil fuels. You have biomass can replace coal, biogas can replace natural gas, and biofuel can replace oil and petrol, diesel. But when you put a limit on it, and in any country I've ever looked at, you would need far more than we have available if you were to do direct replacements. And so all of a sudden what you end up with there is, okay, these are my demands, these are my resources. And a very important one then, you will likely have a scale for bioenergy that's like, this is what I'm willing to use sustainably, or am I willing to start moving beyond certain limits and maybe start taking some arable land or not? And once you have those principles in place, I actually think you start then to fit the jigsaw very quickly in terms of what actually makes up a smart energy system and how much of the different pieces you need to get to zero carbon. And they're the list of things I suppose I gave, or would be my big ones earlier. And I should say, when I gave you the list earlier for Green Plan Ireland, in every single scenario, the aim was to maximize wind and solar as the foundation of the, as I said, energy system, not just electricity system.
Well, we should talk a bit more about wind then, especially given your role as the CEO of IWEA. I think a lot of our listeners will be keen to have your views on the sector's positioning and its importance in the Irish market. A good place to begin might be to understand a bit more about what your role entails. So you're the Chief Executive Officer, and IWEA is an industry organisation. So how do you see your role fitting into the context of the energy sector in Ireland?
It's an interesting role. It's very varied, and we do a lot of different things. I think, like, just one thing to say at the outset is IWEA, as well as kind of being an advocacy group to try and bring policy change for the wind sector, we also run events, we run training programs, we take part in research, we do a lot of communications work as well with the media and wider. So we've really a diverse, let's say, day to day. You can end up working on a lot of different things in a typical week in IWEA. But I think as kind of the advocacy group of IWEA, I think the key thing we see ourselves doing is being a bridge between what can be very high level policy making with very granular day-to-day of actually building a wind farm. And I think there's a really important link to be made there, that just even when people are all trying to do the same thing without understanding what actually happens day to day to actually build a wind farm, policy can have trouble understanding what it needs to do to support it. Because I think in Ireland, we're in a very fortunate position right now where we have a climate action plan that the government brought out last year, where they have a very clear signal that they want to increase from 40% renewable electricity in 2020 to 70% in 2030, while, and this is a really important add-on to that, while the demand for electricity is set to skyrocket in Ireland over the next decade as well. So it's not just an additional 30%, the actual percentage of what you're trying to meet is growing quite rapidly. So like we have around 4,000 megawatts of wind in Ireland today. Over the next decades, the Climate Action Plan suggests we'll need another 4,000 of onshore and at least 3.5. And the new program for government suggests 5,000 megawatts of offshore.
Yeah.
So a huge, like, we're in a very, let's say, in a really nice environment as an advocacy group where government wants what we want, which is to develop more wind energy. But I think even with that backdrop where both the industry wants to do something and policy wants to do it as well, for sometimes just making sure that that line of communication is effective so that policy and industry both kind of move in the same direction is critical, and something that we try to do as a middle ground in IWEA is try and create the links between those conversations.
It makes sense. And it seems like that point about demand growing is a really important one. I guess some of our listeners who are more used to the GB electricity system, they'll be familiar with the gradual declines in demand coming from increased efficiency in some places, eventually being offset by the growth of electric vehicles or electrical heating and so on. But in Ireland, the growth in demand it's happening today, right? With things like the rollout of more and more data centers and so on.
Yeah, it's pretty enormous. So, like, to give you a flavor of numbers, today we consume around 30 terawatt hours of electricity in Ireland. By 2030, that's forecasted to be 44. So that's a 30% just above increase in electricity demand in a decade. And a large part of that, of course, is the new data centers that, like, Ireland has attracted a lot of data centers in the last few years and will continue to do so over the next decade, in combination with the electrification of heat and transport as well. So, when everyone is driving an EV, and a lot more people at least will be driving an EV over the next decade, and heat pumps in people's homes, it all adds up to really back to that philosophy I talked about with the smart energy system, where it's no longer electricity, heat, and transport. It's an energy system underpinned by clean electricity. That's, I think, the world we're about to move into. And I think that's a really, really exciting prospect, as you can imagine, for people that have to produce clean electricity.
Well, absolutely. It seems like you've really got a big challenge to surmount ahead. But I guess it's important also to bear in mind how much progress has been made already in Irish wind, because it's, as I understand it, it's one of the leading wind producers in Europe at the moment.
Yeah, so number one in the world for onshore. So we've the highest share of onshore wind on any electricity system in the world. Now, it'd be wrong of me as an all-island representative body in IWEA if I wasn't to point out that, in fairness, Northern Ireland would be higher if it had its own statistics. So they are doing exceptional work in the north as well as the Republic of Ireland right now. But yeah, it's an incredible achievement for an island power system like Ireland to be number one in the world in terms of share of onshore wind. Right. I suppose I should also caveat, because I'm sure some of your listeners might be very well aware, I'm explicitly saying onshore winds there, because as soon as you add offshore wind to the mix, Denmark actually overtakes us and we become number 2 for wind energy in the world overall. But again, as an island, I would say we probably had tougher odds there because, in fairness, Denmark has very well interconnected power system to a lot of its neighbors, whereas Ireland's is very poorly interconnected at the moment. So, and the other thing is, like, in the next 10 years, we've used very little of our offshore wind to date. We only have one demonstration project that was built 16 years ago. So at the time, the largest turbines in the world, actually, but just never kickstarted the sector, unlike GB, where there's been really great progress made in the UK on offshore wind. So I think, like, it's a great place to be, number 2 in the world for wind overall, number 1 in the world for onshore wind, and really with a lot of momentum building to go well beyond where we're at today. So as I said, EirGrid, DSP Networks, the industry have done great work, policymakers, to get us where we need to go. But I think we really need to build on that now and move on to the next decade. And we're all looking to 2030, like 2020 is nearly behind us. And we're all looking now to try and build on that success.
So could I ask you a bit about, given that track record, what the lessons have been in Ireland from the growth of the wind sector so far? Because I imagine that you don't get to the sorts of levels of wind generation that you've been seeing in Ireland without having overcome a few hurdles.
No, it's absolutely amazing. I have a phrase: it's very hard in life to do the right thing, which is kind of not very intuitive. You would think lots of clean electricity is a really good thing for the planet, but it is absolutely, full of challenges day to day, and there's never something that you don't have to kind of try and overcome. But I think if I was to kind of take the helicopter view and go back to the start before, again, just for the benefit of your listeners, especially any that are not familiar with the Irish situation, the very first wind farm was built 25 years ago. Well, 27 now, actually, 28 now. Wow. But there wasn't a huge build out really for about 10, 12, 13 years after that. So the real build out started in the mid noughties, so around 2005. So it's been 15 years really of going from very little wind to around 36, 37%, we'd hope at least this year.
Right.
And I think if I was to look back on, what happened around that mid noughties time, I think if I was to kind of look at how can we use the experience of the success to date for the future, what happened around that time was there was a plan put in place for an ambition of 40% renewable electricity by 2020 at a very granular level. So there was what was called an all-island grid study, which was released in I think January 2008, that really mapped out in a lot of detail. This is how much wind we will need. This is what we will need to do for our grids to accommodate it. We need to build an interconnector, and that also happened with East-West being built to the UK over that period as well to accommodate this wind. And there was a collective understanding across policy, regulation, industry that this is what we're all trying to achieve, and this is the granular detail of how we need to achieve it. And I think that really kind of what that does is it sets a kind of benchmark that everyone's trying to work towards, but it brings what is a very long, like a very far distanced ambition right back then to the day-to-day of okay, if that's what we want to achieve, that means X needs to be doing Y now, if that makes sense. And I think that really, like in Ireland, we didn't have a huge amount of success in heat and transport. And if I look at why was electricity so successful and why was heat and transport in terms of renewables not very successful in Ireland, I think it was that early stage planning for the long term with a very collective buy-in as to how to deliver it that was really critical. And I think that I think is a huge learning for how countries can do things even going forward as well. I think that really helps.
I think that'll be super relevant in the years ahead, because we're looking at a lot of countries now setting ambitious targets for 2050 or beyond. And I suppose the next step for a lot of them is going to have to be building that granular plan, mapping back what the steps need to be today, and involving the right parties. You talked about the importance of the grid. I suppose another key part of the puzzle is going to be the planning system and getting permissions and consent for these projects.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think grid will be the most challenging in terms of that probably will be the number one thing that people think. Like if I talk to any of the members, in order to develop a grid that can accommodate the levels of wind that we need by 2030 in a decade, I think that would be the number one challenge that people see in Ireland, is just not just in terms of building grid capacity, I should say, but just building a grid that can accommodate effectively 90 to 95% wind power at any given moment,
right?
Which is kind of a phenomenal, technical challenge to try and overcome, to think that at any given moment you could have 95% of the electricity on the island coming from non-synchronous wind penetration. That's what we need to do. I think planning is a huge challenge as well. I think you're spot on. I think with planning, there's a certain amount of timelines you just have to meet that are non-negotiable. And I think the other thing that makes planning such a critical one is it's the first step in a project's life cycle to becoming a reality. Right. We would often say that the three key steps for any project is getting planning, getting a grid connection to the grid, and getting funding to be financed to get built, either through a support scheme or corporate PPA or the likes. And because planning is the very first in that, effectively, if you haven't overcome your planning in the next few years, you're talking 2025, you're not going to have any chance of being around for 2030. So when we're talking about what we want to do by 2030, the planning is very much the front end of the problem, and trying to solve that in the next 2, 3, 4 years is critical.
And we talk about ambitions for 2050, and it seems like a generation away, but really these are problems that need to be figured out in the next few years, it seems. Yeah,
absolutely. And like the one that really brings it home to me is if we built a wind farm today, it would be very likely that wind farm would be operational in 2050. So we're already putting cement in the ground and turbine towers up that are part of a 2050 energy system, and that's how close this all is. So that's it really does kind of, I think that is the big challenge, is the time. The time
Yeah.
to do the things that we need to do is very, very short in the scheme of the infrastructure that we need to build. And we've experienced that in Ireland in the last 15 years. It took on average probably 8 to 12 years to build a wind farm over the last 15 years, to get us to where we are to today. It's a long time in the context of having 30 years to get to zero carbon. So we
Right.
need to shorten those time horizons.
So I'd like to come back to one of the other points that you mentioned, David, and I guess it will be another important ingredient, which is the emergence of offshore wind in Ireland. And this is something that we talk about a lot in the GB context, and I know more and more people are getting interested and excited in what it could mean for Ireland as well. But it would be great to hear your views on what it'll take to build up the capabilities and the scale and the processes and so on to make it happen.
Yeah, I think it's a hugely exciting sector that's evolved, coming to the fore now in Ireland, very much so. As I think, it's a buzzword that we use in Ireland a lot. Our sea mass is about 10 times our land mass in Ireland. So not only do we have a fantastic resource in terms of the wind speed, but in terms of the scale that we can do both on, but especially with offshore, the scale that we can offer is enormous. So I think offshore wind for Ireland is not just a solution domestically. I think it's a solution for Europe, not a solution for Ireland, what Ireland has in terms of an offshore resource. And I think when you look at what is needed around Europe, I think it's going to have to try and play a part, because I just don't think there's enough. For Ireland is in a lucky position where we far more than we will need. So we're absolutely thinking of it in that scale. But going back to your question, which is very much the here and now, the most urgent and critical thing is that in Ireland right now, we're waiting for a bill called the MPDM bill to be passed by our parliament, which will effectively put in place a regime by which you can apply for planning for an offshore wind farm.
Right.
That's a lot more streamlined than in the past. And I think there's a really high level of political awareness as to how essential that is. And it's very, very much top of the political agenda right now to try and do that as soon as possible. So I think that's the most, because until we have that, we're kind of stuck at start, if that makes sense. We really need that, as kind of back to what I was saying earlier, that it's planning first, then grid, then funding / route to market. So we need that planning piece as step one to get resolved as soon as possible. And I think then it's the usual suspects of building the grids that I mentioned to support it, and getting the auctions in place to then finance these projects as they come through those first two initial steps. So I think the prize is enormous. But like we talked about earlier, even though it's such a really exciting thing and there's such a big win at the end, it all comes back to the day-to-day challenges then of just, down at the very granular level, how do we overcome the next step and the next step and the next step? And I think that is very much, for an offshore context in Ireland, it's our consenting regime is very much the really critical next step that we need solved here and now.
So if things do go according to plan, and you get the MPDM bill in place, and the next steps fall into place as well, how quickly do you think it would be possible to ramp up offshore wind deployment? And just to give you a bit of context, a year or so ago, we were talking about adding 1 or 2 gigawatts a year of offshore wind around the GB coastline over the course of the 2020s. Now, I think with the government's target of 40 gigawatts by 2030, we're looking at having to add substantially more in the later years of this decade. But how long do you think it might be before Ireland is looking at hundreds of megawatts or a gigawatt of offshore wind being deployed per year?
Oh, it certainly has to happen very soon. So middle of the decade is when we're aiming for. And I think the scale of ramp up, actually, even though we've probably come much later than GB, the ramp up ambitions is pretty enormous. And so in the current, let's say, program for government, it's to try and get 5,000 megawatts by 2030. But, and I suppose this is the other kicker, it's the aim to get 30,000 megawatts for export. So to try and either export directly to Europe in some way, or else use it as a clean electricity to produce the fuel that I talked about in the smart energy system concept that then could be exported to Europe. So I think that's why, Ireland's narrative and Ireland's offering is to some degree a domestic one, but I think the real scale is our ability to have a really low cost, clean resource in the long run that can be used by our neighbours in either the UK or in mainland Europe as to try and help those other countries to decarbonize, again, not just their electricity sector, but their energy system. And so
Fantastic.
I think it, like, when that is, I think I remember, like, when I mentioned earlier about when we used to do the smart energy research, if you start with the end point of what do you actually need by a certain date and you work backwards, you really start to realize how quick you have to ramp up. It's actually not an option, so if we're to come anywhere close to these zero carbon or net zero carbon levels of ambition by 2050, Ireland, along with many other countries, and certainly in Ireland, we have to be at the multi-gigawatt delivery of offshore wind middle to this decade, to the end of this decade for sure, or else we will be short in the long run.
It seems like an exciting outlook for not just Ireland, but I suppose the other countries around Europe that are going to be interrelated with it in the energy sector as well. But I can't finish the podcast today, David, without asking you a bit about the recent first round of the Renewable Energy Support Scheme auctions in Ireland. I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on the outcomes of those auctions and how you think that those might develop in the future.
Yeah, no, it's great to kind of get, like, that's the first, I suppose, part of our 2030 journey, the first RES auction. So at the end of our old refit support scheme, which was designed to deliver for 2020, and the start of our new support scheme RES, which is designed to deliver for 2030. I think two great successes of it were, one, enough volume came out of it to keep us on track for our 70% target. So just again, for people who are not familiar with this, the 2030 target is not just a 2030 target. The governance directive that comes from the European Commission has interim targets that you have to meet along the way. And the volume that at least has got away in the first of Ireland's RES auction looks like it's keeping us on a reasonably good trajectory to actually stay on track for that target. And that's great as our first auction that it got that much away. And actually, I should also add in that context, it's not just because of the volume that has come out of the first RES auction. It's the volume in the first RES auction plus the corporate PPAs that we also have in place in Ireland right now. Those two combined are keeping us on track. So it's great to see the two of those working in parallel. Again, that's another huge success of the last 12 months, I think, to see those two routes to market existing in parallel. I think the second kind of really positive thing was to see a significant price reduction compared to our old support scheme. So when you compare like for like, it was around a 20% reduction, which is a good start. But I would say we can do better. I think we think there's a lot of room for improvement within the policy and regulatory framework in Ireland. And we published a report in the summer called Saving Money, where we've earmarked major reductions that we think are still possible within the price of wind energy in Ireland for both on and offshore going forward. So again, a good start in terms of volume, a good start in terms of price reductions, but I think we can do more on both. So great to be out of the traps for 2030 and a good start, but I think we've more we can do.
On the topic of renewable energy cost reductions, you mentioned a little bit about how long it takes to develop wind projects in Ireland. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, David, on how much of the future cost reductions might come from the technical side, the actual wind farm technology, and how much might come from streamlining and improving the process to go through development and get the wind farms up and running.
The funny thing is, I suppose they kind of go hand in hand in a way, in the sense that the policy and regulation framework we're in has to allow us to use the latest and greatest technology. So there's somewhat of an overlap there. Now it's not always an overlap, but that's certainly one big part of it. So like when we did the Saving Money report that we launched in the summer, like one of the major cost reductions was, of course, being able to use larger wind turbines. So instead of using 1 megawatt machines like we might have had 10 years ago, we can now use 5 megawatt machines. So that means on the same tower, you're getting a lot more electricity, which is really reducing costs. But in order to facilitate that, we need to make sure we don't bring in restrictions on wind farms, which means you can't use that technology, or else you've just lost all those benefits that the technology is bringing you in terms of cost reductions. And that, like, they're quite enormous cost reductions that you get when you allow the technology that that's the latest and greatest to be used. Like the analogy I often use is, can you imagine a mobile phone 15 years ago versus a mobile phone today? 15 years ago, we were all walking around with Nokia 3310s, that could just about make a phone call. Now we have smartphones in our pockets that, have enormous, developments. And a wind turbine, maybe not electronic and at the same scale, but it is that significant in terms of how much it has improved over the last 15 years. So we really need our policy and regulatory environment to facilitate that lowest cost, latest and greatest technology. I suppose just to give you some numbers again, because I'm sure numbers are always interesting for listeners. Like, we think that there's the analysis that came out in saving money, there's the difference there of 20, 30 euros a megawatt hour if you were forced to use an older machine, less efficient machine versus a new one. So it's enormous
it's a huge
amounts.
Gap, yeah.
Of let's say different in cost, but then there was a whole chunk of other things which were back to just the process on its own. So that's kind of, let's say that there wasn't the overlap between regulation and policy and technology, but just purely regulation and policy environment, and as you said, speed and carrying that up, and probably something in the region of about another 20 euros a megawatt hour plus, so really significant cost reductions that can be achieved by just reducing those timelines, making the steps lower risk. There's really significant savings to be had. And I think like if you were to take a kind of purist view and say you had a really, really efficient, robust, low risk policy and regulatory environment, we are absolutely in the space, no question about it, that wind energy in this part of the world is cheaper than fossil fuels. That is where we are now at for sure. That is where the technology is at. So I think it's a really exciting place to be. Clean is no longer costly. Clean can be better value. And that's great.
It sounds like brilliant news. And it also sounds very encouraging from what you've described, David, that the place that you're at in Ireland is that there's a collaborative approach going on between industry and government and the public to find a solution that works for everyone as you plot out the course for the next 10 years and the next 30 years as well.
I would absolutely say government ambition is aligned with industry ambition, but I'm sure the members would tell me day to day that there's all sorts of disagreements we have day to day with government and regulators and all sorts of things about how to do it. But absolutely, I think there's the ambition level. It's great to be in a country that has this level of ambition for the next decade for sure. And it is very much aligned. So it is like it's in a very exciting era. When you look at what everyone's trying to do now, deliver really like not only clean electricity but local, domestic, indigenous power that creates jobs and investment in your own country to try and solve what is a very, very serious global challenge in climate change.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, David, for joining us on the podcast. It's been really informative to have you in to tell us a bit about your past research, about your work in Ireland and the Irish wind energy sector in particular. Thanks again for all your time, and goodbye for now.
Thanks for having me. Delighted to come on.
That was Ben Collie, Principal at Aurora, speaking to David Connolly, CEO of the Irish Wind Energy Association. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.